And so we begin. This is broadcast number 604, July the 4th, 1983. And we usually begin this broadcast, the World Watches program. Oh, it's KAZU-FM, KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California. 1 year ago this evening, and the year goes fast, broadcast number 552, July 5th, 1982. I was talking about current coups d'etat that were almost to take place but didn't. There was a report of a military coup in Iran that was stopped. The president of the Dominican Republic was shot to death. That was at the time that Edwin Wilson had just come through the Dominican Republic, thought he would be safe, and was taken right from the airport to an American jail. There was a story in New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle by a fellow, Luke Thompson, who worked for Edwin Wilson, telling how the United States, the Defense Department, the CIA, the Special Forces accomplished coup d'etat and trained killers. He was from the Special Forces Green Beret, and he told about being involved in the killing in 1965 of the Dominican Republic of the plans to kill Colonel Dino. In Bolivia, how the CIA murdered Che Guevara in 1967, and that, of course, involved Klaus Barbie down there working for the CIA from the time the war was over, the war criminal. And he told how the United States trains terrorists and military intelligence. A long article of his career as a killer from 1977 to 1982, his latest escapades. Che was killed in 1967. John Ehrlichman had a story in the newspaper that week, how I plotted Richard Nixon's death. Remember, I said that the plans at the time of Watergate were to kill Richard Nixon, that he was too far left because he'd gone to China and the Soviet Union, and they wanted Spiro Agnew. Ehrlichman's attorney at the time of Watergate was Joseph Ball, and he was the attorney on the Warren Commission to cover up the murder of Kennedy, and also the attorney that John DeLorean hired and is working with now, his office, and we'll do more of that. A year ago this week, I was talking about John Belushi, the probe reopens. Can you believe it's 1 year that they said that they would open up again Kathy Smith in the role in killing John Belushi, and this week they stopped the extradition. She's still up in Toronto, Canada. A year goes fast, and I believe, and I'll say it now and I'll fill you in more in the weeks to come, that if they open the Kathy Smith cocaine connections, they'll tap right into Johnny Carson and John DeLorean. And next week I'll go into the details of that. It's a complicated, long story. There's new articles out on DeLorean, but this is 4th of July, and, well, these broadcasts go east and the holiday's long over. I don't want to tax the local people with anything that heavy on a holiday evening. Also, John Hinckley, the planned coup for the United States. There was an article about John Hinckley in the New York Times and his expenses and the doctors that worked with him, that worked with Arthur Bremer, the fellow that shot Wallace, and the psychiatric team from the past assassinations that was working with John Hinckley. Somebody asked me on a radio program in Los Angeles, I did a three-way call Sunday to Los Angeles, about the movie Taxi Driver that was inspired by, the writer was inspired by the diary that Arthur Bremer had at the time that he shot George Wallace, and made the movie Taxi Driver, and then this allegedly triggered John Hinckley with Jodie Foster image of shooting Ronald Reagan. And was there a connection? Well, there is a linear connection between the doctors, the scripts, the intent, because as I mentioned last week, the Posse Comitatus that John Hinckley belongs to believes that Reagan is a pinko too far to the left, just as John Ehrlichman and company thought Richard Nixon was. And a year ago this week, we were talking about Roberta Calvi. He was hung in London, and Mrs. Calvi was blaming the Vatican and saying she thought they were involved in the murder of her husband. And there was a lot of controversy continuing on Raymond Donovan and whether he should be cleared of his links to the mob. And the San Francisco Chronicle and the wire services said there was insufficient evidence to link him to organized crime to remove him as being Secretary of Labor. And this week, Mr. Mullen I believe he was confirmed as head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and he admitted that he lied to Congress a year ago that there were links of Donovan to the mafia and the organized crime. He lied then, and the Senate said, well, don't lie to us anymore. Just say you won't lie anymore. And Donovan is still Secretary of Labor. Does that make sense? If you ran a corporation or business and people were lying to you, when they're under oath to tell the truth, would you promote them? Well, they did. I have a friend who listens to the broadcast. She thought I was too hard last week on certain organizations such as Reverend William Potter Gale and the Ministry of Christ Church. That's the identity movement, and I think identity means identify, because he works with the Interpol Nazi Klan Minutemen list of people who should be offed or watched. I talked about James Wickstrom, the head of the Posse Comitatus, they're both part of the Christian Defense League. They actually, one's a reverend, and the other, they're linked to Christian churches. And she said somebody may think that I am too anti-Christian, even though their names were in the Chronicle and the Associated Press, United Press. I wasn't singling out their religion. I was singling out what they do under the name of religion. But just to give equal time, I'll refer this evening to a book review. It's in the Soviet Union called Along the Road of Aggression and Racism, and it's about the role of Jews in Israel and Zionists being Nazis. It's by Ben Stein, and this is the story about the Soviet pamphlet Along the Road of Aggression and Racism, and the Soviet Union claims that the Jews, the Zionists, only allowed Jews to go to Palestine that became Israel. Otherwise, they had to be killed. That they only wanted the land, Jews to be taken not to safety, but to Palestine, and that they worked with Adolf Hitler. Now, the reason I bring this up, in addition to equal time, is that I partly agree with this thesis. After studying Eichmann's work in the Middle East and Otto von Bolschwing and Himmler's role and Folk Bernadette, and Begin working with the Polish Gestapo and working with Mussolini's brown shirts. And it was Einstein who warned in the late 40s, never let a Menachem Begin be in Israel. That'll be the worst thing that happens for the Jews. And what's happening now are books such as this out of the Soviet Union. Here's some chapters. Business Built on Blood is one chapter. Cosmopolitans, The Gods of War. Another chapter, The Aggressor Deals in Arms. Israel's the third largest arm distributor in the world. Another chapter, Converting Jews into Dust. And this particular person describing the book in the L.A. Herald says, Converting Jews into Dust is the now familiar heartbreaking claim thought to be the only province of Nazis that the Holocaust either never happened or was grossly exaggerated. A few quotes. This is the book. The Zionists exert the maximum effort in order to hide their criminal alliance with fascism in the past. Now, I agree 100% with that statement on everything, every Zionist that I have personally known. And I'm going to make some Jews mad, but that's the way I see it. They are absolutely aligned with the most fascist causes in the world. To repeat, the Zionists exert the maximum effort in order to hide their criminal alliance with fascism in the past. The book goes on to say they unfold a campaign of corresponding falsification from the preparation of historical research. They falsify also by making in the United States historical films or TVs with a false nature of the Holocaust, which the pro-Zionist film studios make in the United States. Now, they make it appear that the Germans or the Americans freed the concentration camps. The Russians went in and freed the concentration camps. And the movies that I've seen on the Holocaust, except for a few occasional independent movies on, as I say, the Liebersborn or the blood types, the experiments of the Nazis, they actually do change the history. I have copies of letters to Jewish organizations, Jewish persons, about the FBI report that I got from the FBI that Joseph Mengele is an American citizen. Many of you know I've talked about it on the broadcast. A person who listened to these broadcasts in Sacramento was with Joseph Mengele in Honduras and with his uncle. And he sent for the papers from Freedom of Information because he wondered why the guy was never tried. And the answer his uncle said, and Joseph, who used another name, and it's in the papers, was because he was naturalized as an American and was joined the Gestapo, came to America like Dr. Urban, who worked with Errol Flynn, and then went back to recruiting for the Gestapo. Now, this book, these are some more quotes from the book, in quotes, the shameful speculation of Zionists at the expense of victims of Hitlerism throws into doubt that heralded figure of 6 million supposedly annihilated. This figure can't be verifiable. It is exaggerated 2 or 3 times by the Zionists. Now, that historical society, the far right-wing group down in Southern California, also says it didn't happen. My personal feeling, and I personally believe that after contacting Jewish leaders in Israel, in Washington, in Los Angeles, Simon Wiesenthal himself, who I've talked to, it isn't natural. It is not natural to hate so much the people that freed the camps. There is something wrong with the mechanism of survival. It just can't be so turned away that only the Russians are bad and only the German and Japanese and Italian Nazis today. Even Mr. Mendelsohn, a head of a Jewish organization that speaks for American Jews, and I'd written to him about Mengeles, and he lied in his letter to me. Mendelsohn had an article last week. I didn't bring it in tonight, and I can give you the date if you want to look it up in the Washington Post. Don't ask Klaus Barbie in France what happened after World War II. We have a limited budget in the United States. Let's deport a handful of Nazis here rather than spend money on finding Klaus Barbie's connections. Now, does that make sense to you? It does. If Klaus Barbie was a cocaine king, if he worked in Peru and Bolivia, if he worked with the CIA, if he had a shipping company, if he visited the United States sending arms all over the world, if he had the Brides of Death in South America, if he has 6,000 Gestapo armed in uniforms paid by American dollars, doesn't that interest you? If he travels to Germany, which he did, and he travels to the United States and he's paid a salary with your tax dollars, doesn't that it interests me? So why is Mr. Mendelsohn a paid spokesman for the Jews saying, don't worry about anything Barbie did in the past? To me, that is horrendous. Now, this book goes on to tell about the role that the Zionists has taken in hiding the Hitler movement for whatever reason. It says this document goes on to say that Hitler colluded with Jews to set up the state of Israel. Now, I know that is true. And that Israel exists as sort of a puppet rump state of the Third Reich. That's a quotation from the book. In a number of these documents of Hitler from 1937 to 38, it indicated that the migration of Jews through the Reichsbank, the money of the Reichsbank, that's Mr. Abst, who's now running the Vatican Bank, Mr. Hermann Abst, set aside special funds for Jews. And this was done for the purpose to create Palestine into a pro-Nazi Jewish state, and the leaders of Zionism strove to make that tragic situation channeling Jewish immigrants only to Palestine. Now, I don't remember, maybe it was a year ago or a year and a half ago, I read to you a pathetic full-page ad written by people in New York City and Europe from Romania, the entire page of the wall of New York Times. Free, $50 a Jew for America, any other country in the world that wants them. That includes their transportation, their everything, passports and everything. If you give us $50, you can save one life. Otherwise, 2 million more will be killed. 4 are dead, and 2 million more will be killed. Put up $50. I bet they didn't have 3 buyers. There wasn't a fund to save those people at all. Those 6 million in Romania went into the ovens, the remaining 2 million in that time period. And this book says that the Zionists were not interested in saving Jews. They only wanted, with the Reichsbank, to take Palestine. See, Britain had Palestine. So what they wanted to do was to take that piece of the Mediterranean away from Great Britain so that Begin could work with the brown shirts and the Nazis to help the Nazis take the territory away from Great Britain on the Mediterranean. This Ben Stein story says, in other words, the Soviet Union now says that Israel as a state is a Nazi state, and that has several implications. And he criticizes the Soviet book. He says the Soviet Union has long believed that the state of Israel has no right to exist, that it is no secret that the Soviet believes it is aimed at pleasing its Arab clients and generally stirring things up in the Middle East. I just read that the General Accounting Office lied to the American people about Israel invading Lebanon, and now they want $50 million because they were paid to invade Lebanon and kill out the PLO for Jamal and the dope-dealing families of the Falange Christian Party. I mean, the Jamal father worked with Adolf Hitler. He set up the Falange. He worked with the Grand Mufti. And I have a book on the Grand Mufti and Hitler. What in the heck is going on? If a Jew can't ask that question, there's no reason for a Gentile to ask it. It begins certainly with the Jewish conscience. When a country like Israel arms South Africa or Argentina, where the missing people are, or the Honduras now, bloodbaths all over the world. Wherever there's fascism, there are Jewish weapons. There isn't a liberal country or a counter-revolution where the Jews help them. It is only to put in fascists. And this isn't new for people that have listened to me often, but I'm giving it more time than I was going. I was just going to read it in passing. But this book from the Soviet Union, which I indeed will send for, is very consistent with what I think Israel is about. It is a military base in order to make war against Russia. Now, you can add that up for whatever you want. That's what it is. And I can't describe some conversations I heard last week I was down in L.A. with some very prominent Jews, and one of them was of the opinion the way to handle the Jewish situation in our particular group is that Israel is the best bulwark against the Soviet Union over there, and therefore you should support it. And if we don't support it, our government will. And they sell weapons to fascist organizations, the Philippines, South Africa, Honduras, wherever there are repressions, wherever there is no freedom, wherever there are Nazis from Germany, Israel is right there with them. So I'll get the book, and I did want to share it with you because it's consistent with what I was talking about. Now, several weeks ago, a couple of times I mentioned the article in the Philadelphia magazine that John Judge sent out, A World Without Grace, and it begins with certain questions that were not asked at the time of her accident, and implies that they could have done more investigations on it. But this article, you can have a world without this story. It is a very superficial article. John was so excited when he saw it that he quick grabbed the issue, went to the place where they have copying machines, copied it, and sent it to me. And I appreciate the effort. Every once in a while, something that looks good, you really get taken by. It's a long article by a man who wrote about the Philadelphia connection to the Kennedy assassination, and it was really good. I promised I'd discuss this with you, but that subject ended as far as that goes. It's a terrible article, and it offers nothing. And so if you're waiting for it, I'm not going to talk about it. That it has no new information that we would want at all. Now, a listener down in Southern California takes a magazine on technology. It's interesting. Her husband was a scientist for the space stations. Many of you, well, I'll go into that story later. It's a long story. It's a new technology magazine. It's called Technology Illustrated. And last month in June, they had a story about G.Gordon, Liddy, and Mitchell WERBELL, and Gordon Novell. So in this issue of July of this technical magazine, Gordon Novell wrote a letter to the editor, and I think you can get by the tone of that what he's saying. Now, Gordon Novell worked in New Orleans. He was with William Seymour, who was the double of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was involved with the anti-Castro Cubans and men that I mentioned last week, Eugene Brading and William Seymour and so forth. And he was part of the assassination network team that Jim Garrison badly wanted to interview and get to the grand jury. Ronald Reagan would not send Eugene Brading to Bradley to New Orleans, and Gordon Novell fled at the same time, and he went to Ohio. And the governor there, the one who instigated the Kent State murders, Rhodes, he wouldn't extradite him. Novell worked for the CIA, and he wasn't extradited. But he's been floating around very prosperous, and his name surfaced again. At the time of Watergate, he was hired by Charles Colson to take his radiation equipment and wipe out the Watergate tapes of Richard Nixon. Now, the Supreme Court said that he should turn over 9 tapes, and he turned over 7, and nobody asked about the others. And the tapes he had were really scratchy and hard to hear, so we don't know what Novell did, but he was very open about the fact that he was hired to wipe out evidence in a criminal matter that involved the President of the United States, or if it involved anybody else, the destruction of matter. But so he has long left Ohio. The case is over with Clay Shaw, and he's objecting to a story that was about him last month. But some of the sentences in this will be interesting to you, those of you who have studied the John Kennedy assassination and current story. He addresses it as master spies, having received your otherwise excellent article last month called The Master of Spy Tech by Vin McClellan, M-C-L-E-L-L-A-N. It was the April issue of the Technology magazine in April of 1983, Technology Illustrated. Having received your excellent article, I would like to go on record with the following points to add to that article. Number one, the meeting I had with Mitchell WERBELL, Gordon Liddy, and Colonel Alan Bell, that's his son, occurred at my request for unique but above-board purposes. Now, Mitchell WERBELL is the fellow I mentioned last week who comes out of DeKalb County, who has training camps for counter-revolution, who trains the special forces, who works with Larry McDonald, out of Marietta, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, who designed the great silencers that are manufactured for assassination and coup d'etat all over the world. He's a white Russian czarist who has supplied arms for killing heads of states and counterintelligence for the Defense Department ever since OSS became the CIA, Mitchell WERBELL. And Mr. Gordon Novell, this is years after the Kennedy assassination, the Jim Garrison request in 1967. He's with Lauren Hall. He's again with Gordon Liddy and WERBELL's son, and this G.Gordon Liddy of Watergate, the Nazi from Watergate, Mitchell WERBELL, and Gordon Novell are all buddies again this year and forever. So he mentions his company with those people. Number two, I won't go into all the points. He says, I'm a New Orleans entrepreneur. However, the U.S. Senate investigators consider me an expert on offshore banking and insurance. He's an electronic man. He works with the guys who do the hits. He's the expert, I guess, for Robert Vesco and Bernie Cornfeld and the floating multinational offshore bankings and insurance. New Orleans entrepreneur. Three, he says, I have done ultra-high technology counterintelligence, such as the role in Watergate, to erase the White House tapes, as well as my substantive financial activities from 1973 to 76. He was involved in New Orleans trying to set up a World's Fair. So he admits his work is counterintelligence, high technology, and erasing tapes. You refer to G.Gordon Liddy and my experience. From having seriously contemplated, I thought of kidnapping Liddy from prison when I was informed by the White House that he could be assassinated by enemies in the Justice Department. So Novell is telling not how the prisoners would kill G.Gordon Liddy because of his work in the United States, but that the Justice Department had planned to murder him. In case you don't think they kill their own, he's describing it here. He said, I have honorably worked for 3 presidents of the United States in the covert capacity of a special consultant in matters of ultra-high technology intelligence. I wonder who the 3 presidents were. If he was working for Kennedy, he didn't kill Kennedy, so was it Johnson and Ford, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford? He says, I have honorably worked for 3 presidents in covert capacity, special consultant, ultra-high technology. And he says, Colonel Bell always knows where to reach me. That's Mitchell WERBELL's son, and they have a shooting compound and ranch in Texas and one in Georgia. Colonel Bell can always reach me, and then he asks them to apologize for some things in the letter or he'll sue them. He says, in the business game of life, it's your move, signed Gordon Novell, and his address is Force One Limited, Chairman Emeritus, New Orleans, Louisiana. Isn't that a pack of nerves? Incidentally, when Rush Harp was in Texas, he was close to a researcher there who's well known, a woman there, and Gordon Novell and Bernard Fensterwald were close friends of hers. I stayed a long distance from her. In fact, as I was in Texas, Penn Jones told me, stay away from her, and I did. And then later people wondered, why didn't you see her? Novell frequented her home, as did Bernard Fensterwald. I've had nothing to do with Novell or their kind or Mitchell WERBELL. But here I read you the essence of the letter to the editor to show you the company they're keeping. Now to update you on Western goals, and it should be the biggest spy story in the United States. It's quietly sitting. I haven't updated it. It's the story of Western Goals, the corporation run by Larry McDonald, I call him Murder Incorporated, out of Atlanta, Georgia. His offices are in the East now with a giant computer, and on the board of Western Goals are people like Admiral Moore and chiefs of staff and military people and Roy Cohn. It's a cross-section of the syndicate, the mob, the spy teams with his assistant Louise Reese and John Reese of the Christian Digest. And I want to do a lot more on them, too. And the scandal came out just a short while back ago that their computer data was being fed not only to the Los Angeles Police Department, but to a private office of a member of the police department. Material that should have been destroyed was in the garage of J. Paul of the LAPD. Long order described on lists of people who should be under surveillance by the police department on their own, who have not committed crimes. This last week, the Los Angeles police had a story. Police spy case figure is silent about his activities. He's still not talking. The Los Angeles police detective, who's a key figure in the ongoing investigation of alleged illegal spying by the Los Angeles Police Department, refused Monday to answer any questions. Detective J. Paul gave a deposition for the American Civil Liberties Union on his illegal spying in Los Angeles. The police commission ordered the disbanding of the investigative committee called the PDID, that's the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, after allegations the unit was involved in widespread spying on individuals and political action groups, and these are judges, politicians, police critics. The police department's internal affairs officers started investigating where the files were and found more than 100 boxes of intelligence files in the home and garage of J. Paul, whose wife had a $100,000 computer linked to Western Goals in Virginia. The materials included folders on police commissioners, judges, politicians, police department critics. Later it was learned that Paul ran a computer system on the side for a private data bank run by Western Goals Foundation. Questions have been raised as to whether he channeled the police intelligence into the private data bank the tax-exempt Western Goals Foundation created in 1979, along with right-wing John Bircher, Representative Larry P. McDonald from Georgia. That's a Democrat from Georgia who is the co-partner and worker with Mitchell WERBELL. And you see the company that WERBELL has with Liddy and Novell, the old hit team. You can imagine how long a critic from the Los Angeles Police Department would last or get a job with this information and these floating hit teams. Last month, Police Chief Gerald Gates was called to give depositions. When asked if he had any reason to believe that J. Paul shared his police intelligence with Western Goals, Gates told the ACLU, "I think there is certainly enough to give us a reasonable suspicion he may have." Now, once it's in the computer, how can you get it out of that computer? It can be taken out and put into another computer, and I believe it'll go down to Austin, Texas, to Bobby Inman's computer for sure, or the computers up at Mr. Wickstrom's farm in Wisconsin, run by the Posse Comitatus. They have computers up there, so they can take it out. But the point is that it went into the hands of Western Goals. There was a marvelous review of Seymour Hersh's book on Henry Kissinger and the slimy activity, I may have time to get into it, that was going on in the White House and betrayal of each other. And one of the worst people involved was Admiral Moore, who was stealing from Richard Nixon's desk with the help of Kissinger, that they had no loyalty to each other. Well, Admiral Moore is on the board of Western Goals along with our great space scientist, Mr. Teller, who wants the nuclear bombs and keeps track of the people who don't like nuclear bombs. That's where the information goes. As I said before, he designs the bomb, and if you don't like it, your name gets into a computer. We're going to take a 1-minute break now, and I'm going to ask you to give to the station. Have you sent in any money? I haven't asked. There's some programs, and I don't know if you're sending contributions or not. I hope there's a lot of checks coming in. Now we're going to do This is side 2. It is broadcast number 604. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, July the 4th, 1983. And it's Mae Brussell on part 2 of the broadcast. I brought in a lot of different articles to share with you this evening that I wanted to update. And then next week, I'm going back at length into detail on some of the subjects, the interweaving connections of Colonel Willoughby, Young Americans for Freedom, Richard Nixon, Senator Joe McCarthy, and people whose names are in the news now, and particularly going into the Johnny Carson, John DeLorean connections, because that is a story. I could do 4 consecutive weeks right now, but we'll do a lot of that next week, and I'll give you some hints on some of the parts that I'm going to be talking about. We Magazine has a story this month, Who Put RFK on Ice? And this is an interesting article by Philip McLunson, M-E-L, not Mac, it's M-E-L-U-N-S-O-N, the interesting chairman of the political science department at Southwestern Massachusetts in the university there. He's head of the political science department. Ray Fabrizio, of course, at MPC, has been writing articles and co-taught 2 semesters with me on the political assassination. We were the first accredited course on American assassinations in the United States. Here's a head of the political science department in Massachusetts. 15 years, this is in essence some of the points he makes in this story. 15 years after the murder of Robert Kennedy, there are still questions that haven't been asked. Now, many of you have studied the Robert Kennedy assassinations, or you have my tapes on those past broadcasts, so you're familiar with a lot of the evidence, and some of it is new to new listeners. He talks about the fact that there was a big investigation when Lee Harvey Oswald was charged with killing John Kennedy. That still isn't closed, but the Robert Kennedy assassination was unimportant to the powers that be. It was a presidential candidate. It wasn't even considered a federal crime. Imagine us living with Richard Nixon and the war that cost $1 million a minute and all the things that napalm that happened, but the man he ran against was killed. That's not a federal crime. It wasn't considered that. So the Los Angeles Police Department did their own investigation, and this is the article. It says that over 600 pages of FBI documents on the RFK case remain classified. Maybe if we opened those up, we'd find out why there's so much apathy in this country. Maybe that would make the young people wake up to say, hey, this candidate was murdered. How was he killed? He was working with the farm workers, working with the blacks. He was trying to arrest members of the syndicate. He locked up Jimmy Hoffa. Tell us more about Robert Kennedy. So far, 600 pages are locked up. And this professor of political science says that the position, he goes into the position of where Sirhan was, how far he was in front of Robert Kennedy, and how the autopsy report of Thomas Noguchi was praised for the great autopsy, but the autopsy showed that bullet 1 inch from the back of the head. And the article has a picture of Noguchi there, and it tells about the man, security guard, Mr. Cesar from Lockheed Aircraft, who was behind Robert Kennedy, who said he sold his .22 gun earlier, but actually unloaded it after Robert Kennedy was murdered. He lied about it. He said he shot in self-defense, but his bullets didn't get into anybody. They went into the back of the armpits of Robert Kennedy, and it tells about Kennedy's gun had 8 rounds and 7 bullets were recovered, but there were the 8th bullet was found in the ceiling, and there were indications no fewer than 5 extra holes in the door frame. And I do have pictures, if you want them, I can photocopy them for you, that show the policeman looking at the bullet holes in the door frame. So that there were guns, again, like I say, with silencers. You can get this article. It's a We Magazine article, and it tells about Sirhan was not alone. He was with that famous woman in the polka dot dress. He was with her before. He was in the pantry. He said, what time does Senator Kennedy come through here? He doesn't say, will he come through here? He knew where he would come. It tells about the company he came with and the evidence of the conspiracy. Now, that seems 15 years ago and a long time ago, but remember, you're still living with the effect of Richard Nixon and the Supreme Court decisions and the dope dealers that he gave more power to. So that case should be opened up for all time, and Martin Luther King's case, so that the blacks can say, yes, you killed him, and next time we have somebody speaking for us, we want a better autopsy, and don't select our leaders, and certainly the Justice Department and the FBI director have no right to tell the blacks in memos who should be their leaders and who they want to get rid of. So there's a lot of homework to be done, and it bears repetition sometimes to talk about these things. And again, it's a whole new generation. They say a generation used to be every 25 years. Now it's every 10 years. So there's movies on the Nazis on television about the blood tests and the genetic selections of people. There's movies on the Rosenbergs and Joe McCarthy. And these articles are new to a whole new generation buying We magazine. They're old hat to a lot of us. We've studied every detail of the case for 15 years, but if any new person comes along and gets involved, it will be a major contribution to this country. There's just a small article today in the paper, but I think it had a certain amount of significance about arrest in Europe. Italy sends a princess to prison. This is out of Rome. Princess Ira Furstenberg, Furstenberg, and that's not the clothes designer. This is Ira Furstenberg, a former Italian film actress. She was an actress, but not just an actress, is going to jail in Italy for 8 months for illegally transferring money out of Italy. The joke is that she transferred $700. She's probably taken $700 million out in her lifetime, like Licio Gelli with his $22 billion. But they caught her with a token amount, but it had to be a big, big case because you don't send her into jail for $700. This was the interesting part of the story. The princess, besides being a movie star, at 42 years old, is the daughter of German Prince Tassilo von Furstenberg, Tassilo von Furstenberg, just as it sounds. She's the daughter of a German prince, and her mother is Clara Agnelli, Agnelli, sister of the Fiat chairman Gianni Agnelli, Gianni Agnelli, Agneli. Agnelli not only is the Fiat chairman, he ran Permandex, he ran Murder Incorporated, again involved with the Borgheses, with Clay Shaw, Mr. Bloomfield up in Canada, and with Gordon Novell. Agnelli was part of Murder Incorporated, and he works with Licio Gelli and the Mussolini's gang and Hitler's group. She has a very important brother, but what I didn't know was that the chairman of Fiat, Mr. Gianni Agnelli, had a German prince for a father. I thought that was interesting because when you follow the Habsburgs and the Thundentaxis and the monarchies and the black princes in Italy and the Borgheses, they're behind so much that is happening today, and people discount it. It says she was discovered by Dino De Laurentiis and made some movies. Another interesting thing, she was married and divorced from Austrian-Hungarian Prince Alfonso Hohenlohe, Hohenlohe. Oh, the whole family was behind Adolf Hitler and the banks and the scandals of the past 40, 50 years. And she also was married to a Brazilian industrialist, Francisco Pignatari. So this little cookie is a pretty important person. The sister of Fiat chairman Permandex, Gianni Agnelli, the daughter of a German prince, married to one of the Hohenlohes and a Brazilian industrialist. Well, you don't believe that they sent that person for $700 to jail. I mean, that's the biggest joke, but for whatever it is, I mean, Carlos Marcello is in jail now, and so is Santos Trafficante in America. But just for $700, it's a tap on the wrist. But it is pretty funny that the monarchies are going to jail in Italy and that the drug money is drawing up. I can't even imagine they got away with that. It's so horrendous you could do an hour on that. And the family connection. So when they start sending them, that's like sending David Rockefeller to jail for sending $700 to Venezuela. The whole thing has more behind it, but it's pretty hilarious, and it has a lot of drama. And the family connections are revealed on these simple little arrest charges. You get a different view. Now, there's one subject I'm not going to do too much on, but I brought some articles in, and that's Ronald Reagan's briefing of the debate running for president. It was very important that he appear knowledgeable on everything. He couldn't be asked a question along with Jimmy Carter and given an answer such as, I'm not familiar with it because I haven't been in Washington, but with the right assistance, I'll be able to handle, with the best advisors of the world, we'll have this solved. No, he has to get 100 pages. The news this evening, and I listened to the car radio, is that Richard Allen said that somebody in the Carter camp threw it over to him. He, just threw it out at him. A lot of stories. Reagan better seize the Briefengate initiative. Instead of Watergate, it's a briefcase. That's by William Safire on the penetration of the Carter camp. There was another story. One probe ends in Carter book furor. Ronald Reagan is at his ranch this week, and Fred Fielding, the attorney at the White House, said, we're not going to investigate anymore. The president has dropped his inquiry. This is like Richard Nixon saying to John Dean, we're going to go to the ends of the world on Watergate. Then he says, well, we'll let the Justice Department do it. The man who represents him in this office is that crook, Fred Fielding. Fred Fielding sends the day the White House has dropped his inquiry. Luckily, the United Press even carried the notice in case people don't remember very much. It said Fielding was a deputy White House counsel with John Dean during the Watergate scandal and was the liaison between he's the liaison now between the Justice Department and the Reagan administration. There's much as saying you better take another look at Fred Fielding. This is what he was doing at the time of Watergate. In case you don't remember it, they're reminding you of his role with John Dean and Richard Nixon. So he's saying we'll keep the president briefed, and by next week you'll have more on this. I don't know who will be sacrificed. Will it be William Casey or whatever, or Richard Allen's already been kicked out for his little payoff under the desk with Nancy and his Japanese photographer. He's doing other damage at Stanford University and is a lobbyist for Japan. Ronald Reagan there's a long article about in the Washington Post. Reagan calls the book Much to Do About Nothing. Of course it's nothing. They're going to ask him questions on what he would do if he was president, and he has stolen from the past president the information on certain situations. And Mr. Stockman, he's the minister from Harvard. He graduated as a minister who runs our Office of Management Budget and the finances and publishes articles that the economic situation is a farce. And he's still on the cabinet. He briefs Reagan. Now, you're to say this and you're to say that. And he takes over the role of Cecil DeMille, coaching him. Can you visualize it? This is what you're going to say, and this is how you're going to rebut it, and this is what Carter's going to say. And there have been many articles, and maybe you've seen them, on how he's to rebut the questions with statistics and facts. And when Carter says in California the taxes went up and you had certain economic problems, and Reagan can answer, they weren't as high as they were in Georgia when you were governor. So he's briefed by his aide, Mr. Deaver, and Mr. Stockman. And, of course, the report continues. The FBI will investigate the filched papers. They call them the filched, the stolen papers. And various members of the cabinet are going into how much was pilfered and how much came out of Jimmy Carter's desk. Again, the privacy of the president, and a man wanting to run for president and taking a book of work that he's done and studied so that you know what he's going to say so you can answer it. That's Ronald Reagan. I just can't believe that this is business as usual. That's Richard Nixon. It's Ronald Reagan, and it's what the American people deserve if they don't get out and vote or split the vote. I mentioned before that's really I'm getting pretty hard about it, but I guess that's what they have to deserve. Well, I mentioned a few minutes ago a story by Jody Powell. He was press secretary to Jimmy Carter on this great book of Seymour Hersh. I haven't read it yet. I got La Popesa, and I'll talk about that for a few minutes. There's so many good books out, and I haven't gotten the Seymour Hersh book, but he makes a certain point here, Jody Powell, about the era. This is the era of Richard Nixon and his administration. It certainly sets the tone for Ronald Reagan because the same people put them into office. Kissinger tales, if true, Jody Powell says, they may be an aberration, but they must not recur. And he tells about how Washington, D.C. is taking sides on the book on Henry Kissinger. He says it's not halfway true or halfway right. He says it's controversial. It's like abortion or nuclear freeze. There's no middle ground. You either agree after you read the 600 pages that Kissinger is a slimy rat, or you believe that Seymour Hersh has some axe to grind, but it's not either way. This is what Jody Powell says. Henry Kissinger says that one of these stories is a slimy lie. Former State Department spokesman Harding Carter III said that Seymour Hersh someday should be honored by history and colleagues for exposing Kissinger and his prince, Richard M. Nixon. And I believe personally that Kissinger is way overblown and that what happened, this aberration in Washington, is Nazi Fritz Kramer behind Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, changing the whole tone of America. That's why I talk so much about Fritz Kramer and the importance of smoking him out, because this is what they've done to this country, and now the pieces of the raw meat are out on the table for you to look at. The name Seymour Hersh, he says, became an almost household word in 1969 with his embarrassingly painful story of America's military history when he described the My Lai massacre. Over the next 12 years, he won prizes for his story on the CIA in Chile, for CIA and domestic spying, for the involvement of former intelligence agents illegally sending arms to Libya. The Price of Power, his new book, continues in that tradition of investigative reporting. And it is distressing. And he mentions several points, Jody Powell does, and maybe you've read some book reviews of it, but he mentions some very salient points that bring out the Richard Nixon, Fritz Kramer, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger era. One, he talks about Kissinger betraying Lyndon Johnson and Cyril Vance and his other friends in high places while he passed secret information from the Paris peace talks to the Nixon camp, at the same time offering derogatory material on Richard Nixon to Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate. To endear himself to the Democrat, he talked tales about Richard Nixon. To help Richard Nixon, he stole from Lyndon Johnson so Nixon would be knowledgeable about the war, which is like Ronald Reagan stealing from the Carter camp, so he's knowledgeable at the time of the elections. 2, he said Kissinger, as National Security Advisor, undermines the Middle East proposals of Secretary of State William Rogers, that he wants to be on top. 3, Kissinger's own peace efforts in Vietnam were being undercut by the president, by Nixon, who he served, and by the Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who is his protege. When Kissinger wants to do something, Nixon and Haig betray him, and this is a heavily documented book. The next point, he says, Kissinger is spying on his own aides and colleagues, which he set the wiretap phones on, and he in turn is spied on by an agent working for the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's Yeoman Redford, who was spying on Henry Kissinger and giving information to Admiral Moore, who's on the board of Western Goals with Larry McDonald from Georgia, filling information, again, spying on us into the Los Angeles Police Department. I bring this up because these characters are involved in collecting data and information on us into secret computers and will not answer questions at the investigations in Los Angeles. They're still at it. That's the point. Jody Powell thinks it's an aberration, but you better be careful if they're still at it. He says Kissinger is the consummate manipulator of the media, protected and promoted by a coterie of journalists whose loyalty was rewarded by juicy bits of information, and that's just for openers in the book, he says. Now, I think that Kissinger and Haig are so overblown, these characters, and you know I have. Any of you heard me for the last 12 years. I began with the story of the Pentagon Papers. I think that they are disgusting. Roy Cohn, Kissinger, Alexander Haig, their social life and everything they do. He says he's the consummate manipulator of the media, and he is. Every time there's something in Iran where the hostages come home or a plane blows up or there's a spy ship outside of Sweden, Henry Kissinger's on Good Morning America, Today Show, as if he's the elder statesman. He's the elder slime, and they continue calling him Henry Kissinger every time there's a crisis. This book, according to Jody Powell, has 698 pages, and you don't have to be willing to accept every allegation it contains for it to be worth reading. Ideally, keep Kissinger's own 1,500-page memoir, The White House Years, close to you to contrast the interpretations of history. I confess to being less than halfway through the process myself, Jody Powell said, and I already say with confidence that the experience is chilling. Whether you end up believing Kissinger is always telling the truth and his detractors are congenital liars, or vice versa, or somewhere in between, it will turn your stomach and it will chill your heart. If he's one fraction of the crud that Seymour Hersh has documented, it will turn your stomach and it will chill your heart. And that, again, is a direct quote. And that's why I say that Fritz Kramer and Carl Wiedenbach, alias Charles Willoughby, and the people that betrayed this country should be laid out and dissected. At least, Jody Powell says, I hope that it will. because the most frightening reaction I can imagine is a shrug, your disinterest. What the hell? That's the way things are. Dismiss it as sordid business. He says that would be the worst thing of all. At the risk of sounding unbearably self-righteous, and I say this is not the way things are done in most administrations, Democratic or Republican. No one who ever served any president can honestly claim that he never did that which he ought not to have done. We've all done this in a few battles and turfs. But here we have something else, a difference in degree, perhaps, but more than sufficient to qualify as a difference in kind. And that's where I say when Reinhard Gehlen came over and the Nazis took over the OSS and the National Security Council and put in the Kissingers and the Haigs and the Brzezinskis and now William Clark, that's when the essence of America went out the window. What we have here is something different than just mistakes or covering up or stealing on each other. He says this is not one of those situations in which responsible people can differ, in which differences and perspectives lead to honest difference of opinion. Who is ever telling the truth, the picture that emerges in this book is one of personal and professional relationships that make Byzantium look like the Waltons. The most rudimentary basis for normal human intercourse have been discarded. No one said what he meant or meant what he said. Loyalty and friendship, not to mention affection and trust, must have perished early on. They perished when Kissinger got $10,000 the year he was at Omer Amagau with Mr. Piper and Dietrich and Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie interrogating him and Fritz Kramer. That's where it all went out, with Walter Rauff, with Joseph Mengele, with Martin Bormann, when he sat in a castle and got a chauffeur, and then John McCloy and Fritz Kramer put him at Harvard to become the numero uno spy. That's where it all went out. The normal human intercourse was discarded. And Jody Powell, if he doesn't know his history, I'll send him a tape on the fact. No one meant what they said, loyalty and friendship. He says, not to mention affection and trust, perished. When the war was over, it was dog eat dog, we'll fight Russia. The Nazis are fine, we'll lie to the American people, we'll lie who are the criminals, we'll release Otto Skorzeny, we'll put the Bormann money in Spain, we'll put it in Madrid, we'll get rid of Evita Peron and her lousy brother, we'll fund the network, we'll deal cocaine, we'll have death squads. That's when the loyalties went out. And if Jody Powell doesn't know it, as I say, I'll send him this history. He says ambition and the means to it and the satisfactions were constrained, at least in any reasonable sense of the word, and those in the position of power and leadership. That's Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, particularly because of the media freaks. Those in the position of power and leadership treated each other worse than they did the rest of the country. The real enemy list of the Nixon administration was and apparently still is composed of his colleagues. And that's what I've said all along. If Martha Mitchell gets a needle in her butt and gets this treacherous cancer 3 years later and is never seen, not allowed to be seen by her daughter until and after her death, and the Attorney General has separated her, only the daughter that she's close to or her children from her, till she has this 3-year terminal cancer, the Jack Ruby type of cancer. I've said long ago, when they do it to themselves, be careful what they'll do to us. If they blow up a Dorothy Hunt plane crash or threaten to kill James McCord and Herbert Colmax, the attorney for United Airlines, and they send Alex Butterfield to Federal Aviation to investigate it, and Mr. Chapin out to Chicago to cover the investigation, when they're blowing up their own and you're sitting on their plane, heaven help you. That's the company you keep when you keep those kind of people in office. Or Murray Chotiner, the guy that discovered Richard Nixon, and Earl Warren, who walks out of his house on a Sunday and is gunned down driven over by a government truck, or the major Watergate witnesses were off. Well, Jody Powell concludes that he says Seymour Hersh is less confident that the chance of avoiding a recurrence will happen, but there's a lesson here to be gleaned from this book, and Hersh is reluctant to say it. The only thing worse here to conclude that this is the way things are going to be decided, and that they would never be this way again, that you better make up your minds that it can happen again. And the proof that's happening again, and I don't know if Jody Powell knows about Mitchell WERBELL and Mr. Larry McDonald with Roy Cohn and Admiral Moore and the top military and their computers in Los Angeles, and they're working with Reverend Gale and the Nazis and the Minutemen and the Klan, and they're deceiving us, and they lie in the media that there's no such organizations, and Moore is working with them. More that can happen and worse can happen. But the point is, in order to get their power, they claw at each other. They tear each other apart. And what this review of the book is saying, how brutal they are to each other. And again, I'm saying, when they do it to each other, I'm not satisfied that it was to them and not us. It was to all of us. And what they did is what they do, because they never went to jail for what they did. So they continue being out. Now, we have about 2 minutes, so real fast I'll just talk. I won't discuss much on this subject, but this is a marvelous book called La Popesa by Warner Books, and I'll go into it maybe in 3 weeks from now. Next week, I want to go into Johnny Carson and John DeLorean and the cocaine connections. That is a fascinating tale I'm unraveling in more details for you. But in the meantime, get La Popesa. This is the blurb that goes with the book to whet your appetite. March the 2nd, 1939, Pope Pius XII became the new pope. And into the Vatican comes a popessa. That was Popessa, a nun, Sister Pasolina, Pascalina, who had secret and unprecedented powers. She lived in the papal quarters, right with the Pope, and the cardinals let her there. They hated her. And the minute Pope Pius XII died, and he was the fellow who worked with Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, she was given her birds and a cage, and she was put in somewhat of a nunnery with the help of Cardinal Spellman. It tells about, in this book, some descriptions. In 1918, Pacelli, he was not yet Pope, he was stationed in Munich and in Berlin. Cardinal Pacelli handed church cash to a young Adolf Hitler. His hope to thwart communism, and the Vatican was putting money eyeball to eyeball, soon to be Pope, with young Adolf Hitler. This book tells Pacelli engineering the Lateran Treaty in 1929 between the Vatican and Mussolini, where the Italian government gave $100 million to the Vatican in exchange to approving the appointment of priests in the country and other political decisions. The role of Pacelli in the appointment of an independent financial advisor, a Jewish banker named Nogara, Nogara, who invested his fortune in armaments of the Allied and the Axis nations and pharmaceutical concerns such as birth control for the Vatican, making money off of birth control. So getting back to where I started with the book in the Soviet Union, about the Jews working with Adolf Hitler, it's also listed in this book. You don't have to see it in the Soviet Union. You can get it from Warner's book. Well, now we're out of time. It's just about 20 seconds until World Watches is over, so we have to fold up and continue with 100 of the best stories next week. And maybe get 5 or 6. In the meanwhile, do your homework, read your papers, your newspapers, and your books, and study these things. And I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California. KAZU FM.